Welcome to the Music Historian's Corner. I'm Josh Friedberg, and today I'm looking at an often overlooked topic when it comes to one of the most acclaimed artists of the last half-century, Bob Dylan. Thankfully, however, with scholarship published within the last decade, Dylan's relationship to race and specifically to blackness has been analyzed in several readings. Today I examine two essays that scrutinize different periods in Dylan's career in relation to race and talk about some of the implications of these arguments. Barry Shank, an American Studies specialist, wrote a brilliant journal article published in 2002 called That Wild Mercury Sound, Bob Dylan and the Illusion of American Culture, which focuses on Dylan's early career and its roots in practices of blackface minstrelsy, the practice of whites imitating blacks with dark makeup in public performances filled with ugly stereotypes often associated with the late 19th century. Now, as critics like David Yaffe note, in the late 20th century and early 21st, Dylan has become fascinated with minstrelsy, to the point of even naming an album after a 1993 study of blackface minstrelsy by Eric Lott. The album title and the book title, by the way, is Love and Theft. But Shank's analysis of Dylan's 60s work shows that in his early folk years, when Dylan is depicted as the civil rights supporting hero who wrote anthems like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin', Dylan's career reflected a contradictory desire for what Shank labels autonomy and authenticity, as rooted in traditions of blackface minstrelsy. Now, what that means, as I understand it, from the article, is that Dylan had a desire to both belong and not belong, to be part of something larger and to be a separate minority, to belong to a white community while in some way attempting to be black. Shank connects this desire to Dylan and also the larger folk scene and much of the white involvement in the black civil rights movement. So this is a controversial argument. Shank uses evidence from Dylan's lyrics, his singing, and his harmonica playing to show how supposedly anti-racist music had significant roots in a complex and often, not always, but, well, Shank would say not always, I guess, but often, racist tradition. So this implies that perhaps Dylan's fascination with practices of minstrelsy is much older and deeply rooted than most critics and historians have realized. Now, more recently, Yaffe, the critic mentioned before, his 2011 book, Bob Dylan, Like a Complete Unknown, includes a very different, comprehensive essay on Dylan's relationship to blackness over his career. In Not Dark Yet, How Bob Dylan Got His Groove Back, Yaffe notes the irony in Dylan's voice when singing blues in the 60s, while arguing that Dylan's voice later in his later work sounded truer to the sound of older bluesmen Dylan listened to in the 60s. Now, I'm not exactly clear on how exactly Dylan got his groove back, according to Yaffe, but Yaffe writes that after Dylan's mid-career crisis, which involved religious conversion and a marriage that's not known about usually, to a black backup singer which produced a child, Dylan was inspired by a mystical encounter with, quote, his inner soul sister, so that he no longer needed his group of black backup singers. He could replace them and deliver the same thing himself, somehow. In the following decades, as mentioned, Dylan engaged with themes of blackface minstrelsy directly. So I'm not sure if Dylan finding his inner soul sister made him more consciously aware of his own limitations and trying to deliver black music, if that's what the argument suggests. Now, Yaffe also writes about Dylan's civil rights years. Those that Shank writes reflected traditions of blackface minstrelsy as being more serious in their political intentions despite the irony in Dylan's singing. Yaffe also shows how Dylan's career had come full circle by 2010, when President Obama had Dylan play at a Black History Month concert. Dylan had been, quote, endorsed back by a black man he had endorsed for president, the first presidential candidate Dylan had ever endorsed, nearly 5 decades after his songs were sung at the March on Washington. Now, after reading both articles, it could be inferred that Shank would argue that most, if not all, of Dylan's career involved the influence of blackface minstrelsy, including his mid-career crisis with black backup singers and afterwards. However, regarding his 60s work, in the documentary Bob Dylan, No Direction Home, I remember Dylan calling himself something like never really a political person, which may sound shocking coming from the man who wrote A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall and With God on Our Side. But could it be argued that a song like Masters of War is so over the top in its angry declarations about war and death as to betray its writer's limits in meaning what he's singing about. Now, proving Schenk's point, Dylan may have had a desire to both belong and not belong to political movements, to be authentic and autonomous simultaneously, like white blackface minstrels. Now let's consider the implications today of Dylan's involvement with practices of blackface minstrelsy. Could there be a contradictory longing for autonomy and authenticity among whites involved in movements against white racism? Movements started by blacks and other people of color, with whites that might involve elements of what Schenck calls blackface pleasure, quote, when whites attempt to sometimes lead such movements. Or in the academy, could white college students talking like authorities on race in ethnic studies courses perpetuate the racism that allows whites to think of themselves as experts in a society founded on white supremacy? This question has particular import for me as someone whose minor at college was African and African American studies, and who admittedly talked a lot as if he could understand black history, perhaps beyond readings about it. It's questions like these that are crucial to ask for anyone implicated by issues of race in the US, which, like it or not, is everyone in this country. So whether or not you enjoy the music of Bob Dylan, I ask, what can we do to even attempt to change the dynamics of privilege and oppression in this country, if we find it necessary for a better world to do so? Until next time, this is the Music Historian's Corner, and I'm Josh Friedberg. So long.